Okay, so thank you all for having me here at this conference and for listening to my talk. So I'm here to speak about ordering the world from Herat, sacred kingship and governance in Timurid Khorasan. So for those studying pre-modern Afghanistan, when it was more often than not under the rule of Turkic sultanates, the nature of Islamic sovereignty and theory of practice has been a prevailing concern. Nowhere is this subject more salient than in the study of the Timurid Empire, once unified from the edge of China to Anatolia, but fragmented after the death of Timur the Conqueror. In this context, theories of sovereignty, which sought to sacralize rulers as both perfect humans and philosopher kings, were in high demand among the competing sons of Timur, who attempted to justify their claims to universal rule. This was the state of political theory when the Timurid Empire was at its apogee. But today I will trace the Timurids' political philosophy from their peak to when they were at their end in the late 15th century. I will conclude by addressing the relationship, or lack thereof, between that philosophy and governance in Timurid Khorasan during the reign of Sultan Hussein Paikara. But before getting directly to Herat and Khorasan under Sultan Hussein, I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by Timurid political philosophy. The Timurids lived in an era when politics were post-caliphal, meaning that political innovations of the time responded to the end of the centuries enduring Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. Based in Baghdad, the Abbasids were significant because they remained essential components of Islamic sovereignty well after losing nearly all effective authority. Although it was a Sunni political institution, for instance, the Shi'i Boyyids had preserved the caliphate and used them in political rituals, even as they took control of all Abbasid lands in the 10th and 11th centuries. This pattern continued with the Sunni Seljuks and other sultanates from the 11th century onward. In effect, as Asfar Muin has argued, the Abbasid caliphs lost all power in exchange for becoming a sacred object, a desired relic in the contest of Islamic sovereignty. In this way, the caliphate sanctified as rightful Muslim sultans those rulers who had come to rule through force and conquest. This paradigm concluded when the Mongol Hulagu Khan killed the caliph in 1258. Thereafter, descent from Chinggis Khan became a necessity for rulership across Muslim Asia, even until the reign of Timur. Timur himself ruled as a royal son-in-law through his marriage to a Chinggisid princess. Moreover, he claimed only to be the emir or general of the true ruler, a Chinggisid Khan who had come to perform much the same function as the Abbasid caliph once had. This changed once again with the descendants of Timur, who made their progenitor their new model of sovereignty, but not as a mere conqueror. They took advantage of the idea, which first took root while Timur was still alive, that Timur was the Lord of Auspicious Conjunction, or Sahib Kiran, an astrological messiah who would usher in a new dispensation. In this schema, Timur was ordained by God through the intermediation of the planets and stars. In repeating this term as Timur's primary title, the courtier intellectuals of the Timurid princes assured that this sanctity would also be ascribed to his descendants, but in terms increasingly Islamicized and Neoplatonized. It was not enough for Timur to be a lord of conjunction. His descendants had to become Sufic, Neoplatonic, and Islamic messiahs themselves. Iskandar Mirza, who briefly ruled over the Western Timurid Empire from the city of Shiraz, for instance, articulated himself as a philosopher king with preternatural knowledge of all the traditional and intellectual sciences of Islam, a chief scholar among the many scholars that he gathered to his court. And he did so to assert himself as a capable competitor to Shah Rukh, who ruled from Herat and sought to unify the two halves of the empire. But although these two were opposed, they operated on similar vocabularies of sovereignty. In his Zafarnameh, the famous biography of Timur and Shah Rukh, the astrologer and philosopher Sharafuddin Ali Yazdi spoke of Shah Rukh in glowing terms as a possessor of knowledge and a version of caliphate that owes much to the Neoplatonic Sufi philosophy of Ibn Arabi. So this was a primordial caliphate with authority, like the authority that was first given to Adam, not authority derived from familial proximity to the Prophet Muhammad, as was the paradigm that the Abbasids had. So in this way, the Timurids became spiritual and temporal rulers, effectively saint kings. But the question remains as to how this might relate to governance. In truth, the theory of sacred kingship was never considered to be fully separate from the daily acts of administration. In the political ethical literature of post-Mongol Islam, for instance, the body of the Sultan was considered representative or microcosmic of the body politic, society, and the body cosmic, the universe. The creation of a just society was incumbent on justice, or a translation that I like to use, equilibrium, in the person of the Sultan, i.e. a Sultan could not expect to rule justly if he was not moderate in his behaviors and attributes. Importantly, this way of thinking about the Sultan's governance was functionally equivalent to the governance of the saint, who possesses spiritual caliphate, particularly the Qutb or pole who holds the fabric of the universe together. So in short, both sultan and saint, as well as the saint king, were expected to proliferate justice throughout society through proper conduct, ritual action, and self-cultivation at the top of the social hierarchy. In this dynamic, courtly activity is meant to sympathetically produce effects in the real world. The king's realm, in fact, could be divided entirely between an inner court, which is the court proper, and an outer court, everything within the king's domain. World ordering is made possible through human alchemy and theurgy at the level of the sovereign and his courtiers. This kind of administration is what I refer to as microcosmic governance. I suggest that it was prominent across the empires of pre-modern Muslim Asia because it accomplished two things. One, it allowed for the imperial sovereign to be elevated in an absolutist and charismatic fashion as the center of the universe. And two, it imagined an orderly and well-governed domain when bureaucratic, communicative, fiscal, and military control were often sparse or fleeting. So this administrative realization of Timurid political philosophy meshed with other elements of Timurid governance, which I won't get into for time. But finally, we must ask whether any of this holds true for late 15th century Timurid Khorasan under Sultan Hussein Baikara, the final iteration of the Timurids outside of the Mughals in South Asia, who are also Timurids. Sultan Hussein's Herat has been considered by scholars like Maria Sabtuni the peak of the Timurids' Islamization and sedentarization. Herat, in this view, represents the pinnacle of Sharia-based rulership, a renaissance of Islamic art and architecture, and a shift in focus toward agriculture for wealth generation, instead of taxes forbidden by the Sharia. I cannot and nor do I wish to dispute any of these points, but I have wondered in my reading where in the written record and secondary literature on late Timurid Herat is the Baroque political philosophy, overt sacred kingship, and the microcosmic governance that was so prominent among the early Timurids. The truth is that it simply is not there. To my knowledge, it vanishes from the historical record. But while a typical explanation of this lack might concern the supposed turn to Sharia-based legitimacy, let's consider what that might actually mean. So for one example, like that might mean making wine illegal for the common people. These were listed as regulations that they did. Making wine illegal for common people, promoting moral inspection of the markets, patronizing pious Sufi saints, and most importantly, the abolition of non-Islamic taxes. So this is what is actually meant when people talk about the Islamization, like these things that have functional importance, but don't necessarily touch on the actual like political legitimacy. So in brief, I suggest that Timurid Khorasan's Islamization, if we can call it that, and its turn away from sacred kingship were the result of a larger change, the dramatic loss of imperial ambition and competition. Here it is best to remember the direct causes of the development of Timurid sacred kingship, the existence of a vast empire and the heated competition for it among the descendants. In this context, innovations in political philosophy could set you apart from your brother or nephew who also wanted to claim all of the empire. But in the late 15th century, the Timurids of Transoxiana and Khorasan were small states. They had stopped fighting with one another for the most part, and revenue generation by exacting non-Islamic taxes upon conquering a city had become increasingly untenable for an exhausted populace. Troop movements had destroyed too much farmland and infrastructure, and an exhausted populace perhaps could not provide the same degree of manpower as it once could. The Timurids had become provincial governors of far more manageable, smaller territories. They aspired to homeostasis, not to world empire. So to conclude, I would argue that microcosmic governance and the whole edifice of Timurid sacred kingship receded as imperial possibilities were lost. So thank you for your time.